I wanted to ask kind of a provocative question to start with, which is, why are all your friends becoming Christians?
So I think the thing they have in common is me. And so I am so and individually and completely responsible for that. So many people, Rafe, have been saying to me from many different domains, but they'll say, something's happening, John. There's a coalescing happening. Like biology and theology are talking to each other. And who would have ever thought of that? And weird stuff like that. All these weird connections are being made and all these new communities are emerging.
John, welcome back to the Evolvement of Play Podcast. It's always a joy to be able to speak to you. You and I have been talking quite a bit behind the scenes, just one-on-one, but we're bringing the Evolvement of Play Podcast back. And of course, I was really excited to catch up with you. A lot of things have been going on in your world. You've been a very, very busy guy. So let's start there. Like you were just telling me, you've got how many courses you're working on?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you, my friend. I was teaching 4 courses in person at the university, 2 of them brand new. The consciousness course, I've taught a course on consciousness before, but I just redid this one from scratch to put it in conjunction with the book that Greg Enriquez and I are writing on consciousness, that we're more than halfway through. We should be done the manuscript by April. And then I did another course, which turned out to be, well, I expected it was, and it turned out to be very profound. It was very profoundly received by my students. It was a 4th-year seminar course on the cognitive science of religion. And I feel it's kind of the apex of everything I've been working on and everything that's happening right now, all coming together. I'm turning that into a book called Reimagining Religion. And then I had 2 online courses, one on Jonathan's platform that has finished called The Cognitive Science of Ritual, which will also go into the book on religion. And then another course that's on my own platform, the lectern, called Einstein and Spinoza's God, which I'm also turning into a book. And I've got 2 more lectures to go on that one, and then I'll be done for a bit. So doing all that. So there's the 3 books. Got another installment of Mentoring Machines is going to come through. And then working on a bunch more publications rolling out and a bunch of papers in submission, and writing another paper in January on Platonism as a living tradition. So it's been an enormously demanding time, but creative, powerful. And of course, I just got back in November from the LA book tour. Eric Foster from Upfire set me up with a bunch of large podcasters, and those were amazing. I couldn't have wanted it to go any better than it did. That's been fantastic. And then I guess some people might have noticed that the gospel seminars have dropped, and I'm on that as well. So yeah, there's a lot happening for me right now.
Yeah, you're in the eye of an interesting storm, right? And I think it's so fascinating, right? Having watched like Jordan Peterson sort of rising up from the ranks of the professorate, and then watching yours, and Jordan essentially kind of has to end up stepping away from academia. But it seems like you've been able to utilize your YouTube platform to really increase your academic productivity to an extraordinarily, it looks really absurd from where I'm standing. The level of productivity you're reaching at a fairly late point in your career. I mean, not, I guess from an academic perspective, are you kind of like midlife or late midlife from productivity?
Well, I mean, I just had my birthday on Sunday, so I'm 2 years away from official retirement.
Yeah.
I'm going on sabbatical in January, so yeah, I'm sort of facing some major decisions ahead of me right now. I mean, myself in partnership, I think with everything, except for one, with Christopher Mastic-Pietro, I'm also doing a lot of consulting on the development of various apps and important social media hardware. And so I have lots I can do. So I am kind of like really sort of setting back. I've created a huge space because I'm going to be doing the Philosophical Silk Road, which is like this major thing that I'm going to be doing next year, the filming for it and the production of it. And then I don't know where I'm going to be after that, to tell you the truth, Rafe. I mean, I'll still be your friend. I know things like that, but I don't know where I'm going to be and who I'm going to be. And I'm just trying to, in service to the Philosophical Silk Road, I'm trying to stay as open and as vulnerable to transformation as possible.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful ethos. I am sort of on one side of a process that I definitely didn't know that what I would be on the other side of myself. So I understand that. And I definitely trust that whoever you are on the other side, it's going to be really wonderful to connect with whatever the work is that you take on and everything that you're doing. So just to clarify for the audience, when you said Jonathan, that's Jonathan Pajot, The Symbolic World. So if people want to check out that, check out The Symbolic World. You also had, I don't know if you mentioned it, but I believe you have some courses that either came out or are going to come out on the Peterson Academy as well.
Oh, yes. I forgot that. Yeah, there's that too. Yeah, the course on intelligence, rationality, wisdom, and spirituality is out. Then there's two more, an introduction to general intelligence, and then the one that I'm actually most proud of, which is the primacy of beauty, which is coming out. I'm hoping to do a couple more. I'm planning to do one on Johannes Niederhauser's Halkian Academy. I've done a trilogy. Well, I plan to complete the trilogy there. I did Beyond Nihilism, Ultimate Reality, God and Beyond, and then I want to do God in the Between, the work of William Desmond. And so I'm going to be doing that in the new year as well.
Yeah, I have to say, like from my perspective as a friend and student of your work, it kind of feels like you've been building up a lifetime's worth of philosophical, scientific work, and then you got kind of unblocked to produce a lot of it. It's like it feels like 20 years worth of work is coalescing, or 40 years worth of work is coalescing. Short period of time.
Very much. And like you said, which was unexpected, the awakening from the meaning crisis has just afforded so many academic connections and collaborations. Got a paper in now with Hussein and Daniel on From Flow to Mystical Experience, talking about the cognitive continuum. Jun Sung Kim and I, a former student of mine, we've got a paper in on a naturalistic explanation of qi. And so a lot of stuff that has been on the burners for 10 years, it's all coming to fruition. Well as a bunch of new projects are falling into my lap or I'm creating. It's been draining. I'm enough of a psychologist to recognize. About 2 weeks ago, I was saying to Sarah, I'm in burnout. I know it. I know the psychological and physiological symptoms. But I knew I also had very limited time that I had to be at that level because
Yeah.
I had a day, November 29th, when it ended. And so I just had to keep going until I got there. And so I mean, I'm still working every day, but I have large periods of time where I'm just doing recreation and relaxation. So
That's wonderful to hear. As someone who's done a lot of burnout, a lot of push to create work and, under difficult circumstances in certain ways. Yeah. The idea of moving to that point where you feel comfortable to work at a sustainable rate is a beautiful, beautiful thing.
yeah, I'm really liking it. It's like I was working, evenings and weekends kind of thing. And now I have my evenings and my weekends back. And I usually can start the evening, fairly early. And so, yeah, it's a much more humane pace. And so that sort of tiredness in your bones and that sort of weird penumbra of despair in your mind, that's all gone. I mean, Sarah's away right now. She's in Quebec. She's finishing up her certification, her training to be a yoga instructor, because we are planning when we're both retired that we're going to lead retreats together. And so I'm missing her a lot. So that's the only negative affect for me right now.
That's beautiful. I'm excited to see what kind of retreats come out of what you get. I mean, maybe there's collaboration there down the road.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, we're going to talk about that for sure. You can count on it.
Yeah, sounds good. I wanted to ask kind of a provocative question to start with, which is, why are all your friends becoming Christians?
So I think the thing they have in common is me, and so I am so and individually and completely responsible for that. I don't know. That's a really good question. I mean, joking aside, I think it's reasonable. People tell me this, that the work I've done has afforded people to return to the consideration of a religious way of life as something that's viable to them. And that because I do a lot of work on Neoplatonism and notions like logos and agape, Christians find that route of deep recovery possible to them. I think, strangely enough, me rejuvenating to some degree Socrates has allowed people like to rejuvenate Jesus by constructive comparison and contrast. I think that's like when people when people saw an alternative of internalizing the sage, they were able to re-internalize Jesus, I think, rather than it being just sort of culturally automatically expected without ever being properly enculturated or educated. So I think those are the factors for which I can take some responsibility. I think what's also happening right now in the advent of the sacred, I think you have a little bit of selection bias. I mean, I know a lot of people, including my students, who are returning to other religions because of my work, and that's important to just note. But I think now to properly shift where most credit is due, I think all this is one of many symptoms, in the positive sense of that word, of what I'm calling the advent of the sacred. The fact that the way in which sacredness is conceivable and experiential and can be experienced by us, the way we can apprehend it and appreciate it, indwell it, internalize it. uh, All of these are not quite right, but that it's undergoing a change. It's undergoing the kind of change that we had in the Upper Paleolithic transition, I believe, or the Axial Revolution, or the Renaissance. I think, or the birth of Buddhism, or any of these things, right? The advent of Christianity. We're celebrating that sort of right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So I think what's happening as a response to the meaning crisis is, well, part of what's happening, one small digression, I won't take very long, is I've been going through a lot, now that the book is out, yay, self-promotion, that I've been going through a period of significant, and I did it on a lot of the podcast criticisms of what was, what would I like to have corrected in the book, or what do I want to correct going forward? And there's been a bunch of those. But the one thing that's happening right now is I am doing a sort of a deep reformulation of meaning and meaning in life. I sort of had in the past, I just sort of adopted the psychological construct, which was very odd for me to do, since I have been somebody who has gone in and criticized typical psychological constructs like mindfulness and wisdom and intelligence. And then I just took this one on board, even though it has a lot of the flaws that I critique in other constructs. And I've been going through a very deep reconsideration of what are we actually talking about when we're talking about the meaning and the meaning crisis, because it doesn't line up exactly with the psychological construct meaning in life. It does and it doesn't. It's more complex, of course. And why that's happening is because the advent of the sacred is making me reflect upon what it is that was actually at risk in the meaning crisis and come to some new considerations and conclusions. So it's sort of looping like this.
Hmm.
Um, and and I think that's happening all over the place. Other symptoms of the advent is this. So many people, Rafe, have been saying to me from many different domains. Now, obviously, there's selection bias because they're talking to me, but they'll say, something's happening, John. There's a coalescing happening. All, like biology and theology are talking to each other. And who would have ever thought of that? And weird stuff like that. All these weird connections are being made, and all these new communities are are emerging. Um, and so I think why a lot of my friends are becoming Christians is because I think the advent of the sacred has touched them. I think perhaps in some small way, my work has contributed to giving them a way of framing a relationship to the sacred and to transformation and the cultivation of wisdom. And I think there's a lot happening in the appreciation of Christianity. I think as we're starting to as we're starting to enter what might be the rain shadow of wokeism, which was, I've argued, basically a trivialized version of Christianity,
Yeah.
that people are seeking now a deeper version of what had been flattened in extreme wokeism. And I think that's also happening as a culture thing. And I think there's a new sense also of that we've done enough shredding of Western civilization, and we should now balance that off with a proper appreciation for it rather than I get it. We needed to break free from deifying Western civilization. That was
Hmm.
dangerous, and that was worthy of deep, sustained historical, philosophical critique. But now we're getting to the stage where we're going too far and we're demonizing Western civilization. which I find very problematic. And I think one way people are trying to recover what was of value in Western civilization is a return to Christianity. I would also say return to ancient Greek philosophy. It's also going through a huge revival.
Yeah.
And
Stoicism.
those go ahead then. Sorry.
No, I just Stoicism in particular. You see
Oh,
huge
yeah.
of Stoicism being picked
Yeah.
up and propagated at various levels of the culture.
Yeah. And then the two of those are coming together in something that no one would have predicted, I think, 10 years ago, which is, the surge in popularity of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, precisely because it brings those two, the return to a Neoplatonic vision, Christianity together.
It's interesting because when you say it like that, I have this sense of like, so it's interesting to hear you talk about this stuff and think about my life experience and kind of where I enter into these things,
Of
because
course.
without getting too autobiographical, my mom sort of noticed that something was unusual about me when I was 2 years old. And she was reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee to my dad. So for people who are not familiar, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is really kind of landmark history because it's the first major history that tries to tell the story of the conquest of the Americas from the Native American perspective. And of course, it's very focused on many terrible things that Westerners or Americans did to the natives. So that was pretty formative for me. And so the idea of a kind of guilt that is associated with being Western is something that I imbibed at a very young age. And that has gone from the counterculture to the culture, right? Where I live, that is what my kids are taught all the time, right? I have to talk to them about the reality that the Native Americans weren't peaceful all the time. And there were wars and wars of conquest and genocides and slavery and all of the things that we now sort of associate only with Western culture. Most of those things were present, and in many cases actually worse in some of these cultures that we have come to sacralize or fetishize or totemize as contrary to what we'd like to escape about our own culture. So I'm going to stop there because I definitely can get very autobiographical and make very long essays in the way that I talk. But I think it's a really important thing. Okay, so the point I was trying to make is the re-examination of the Western heritage and a desire to connect with it in a positive way. This was something that really attracted me about Jordan Peterson's work. This idea of the recovery of the bones of our fathers from the underworld as the necessary precondition for the heroic positive reconstruction of a culture. And so the reapproach to Christianity happening at the same time as a reapproach to Stoicism and Plato and Aristotle, it all is that process of the recovery of the bones of our fathers in some sense. But it's playing out in very, for me, unexpected ways, right? I want to just say to the audience, I'm not going to turn this channel into a Christian apologetics channel. So, but it is worth knowing that I have largely converted to Christianity myself, and so that I'm not observing this as a kind of unbiased outsider. But I also am not observing it as a kind of doctrinaire person who thinks, okay, it can only go this direction. This is the proper direction it can go. There's a curiosity at the heart of like, what does it mean to reintegrate the Greek philosophical fathers? To what degree is Christianity, in some sense, a kind of, I have a sense of the type of Christianity that I'm reaching towards, the Eastern Orthodoxy, what Jordan Hall is talking about. It's very congruent with, and in many ways completes the story of the Greek philosophical tradition. And then a lot of that Greek philosophical tradition is somehow lost along the way. And the Christianity that I was exposed to as a child, the evangelical movement, had lost a lot of that depth and a lot of that subtlety of thinking. And so I'm gesturing at it. I don't really know exactly what I'm trying to say, but It's what occurs to me as you're saying this.
Yeah, I think that's right. Your appraisal, I think, is right. I mean, it's clear that the Cappadocian Fathers and you know, uh, you know, Dionysius of the Areopagite, Maximus the Confessor, people I'm going to be meeting on the Philosophical Silk Road, definitely saw Christianity as the continuation.
Culmination. I think culmination would be the word.
Culmination, yeah. Yeah, that's fine. The culmination of the Greek philosophical tradition that goes way back. It goes back to Justin Martyr, and even before Clement. Clement is doing it in Alexandria, and of course Augustine is doing the same thing in the West. He explicitly says that he understands Christianity as the completion and culmination. I'll use your word of the quest for wisdom was exemplified in Greek philosophy, and he continually gave credit to Plato and the Platonists for affording him becoming a Christian. He repeatedly says explicitly in Confessions, he couldn't have become a Christian without that Platonic way of thinking that makes an understanding of God possible. And we lost that. I mean, I've talked about that at length in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and it's in the book. And the book is not just a quick sort of promotion. The book is not just a transcription of the series. The book is written in dialogue. It's not dialogue form, but it's in dialogue with Christopher Mastropietro. So it's definitely a book written by the two of us, sort of making use of the video series. And it has a lot in it, therefore, that's not sort of there in the video series. Chris does what he always does. He makes the work much more accessible, much more lyrical. So we talked a lot, the argument I was making, other people have made it too, Mark Taylor, that the Protestant Reformation represents a fork in Christianity. And people have challenged me on this, but I think overall, whether or not Martin Luther intended this or John Calvin intended this, that's kind of irrelevant to the argument, because what happens is Protestantism starts to move away from that philosophical heritage. It starts to bind itself to modern philosophy, Cartesianism, Kantianism, Hegel, and then eventually to just sort of post-Hegelian, watered down versions of all of that, like Schleiermacher and others, who, by the way, is a great thinker. I don't mean to make him sound like some sort of hack. Yeah, but so we lost the profound tonos, that creative tension between Plato and Christ that was at the heart of, I think, Christianity as the spiritual backbone of the West. And the thing, of course, is, and part of the argument I've been making, is Neoplatonism did that elsewhere. It did that in Islam with Sufism. It did that within Judaism and Kabbalah and forms of Jewish mysticism. Rafe, are you still there?
I'm here. Okay. So we have a new camera, and hopefully that might be a problem, but I might have to hit the button a few times. If I disappear, I'm just going to hit a button. It'll be back.
Okay. I won't panic then. And of course, it also enters into this crazy sort of secular thing called the Renaissance. The Neoplatonist, the Neoplatonic revival drives the Renaissance and feeds into the scientific revolution. So I think as Christianity severed itself from that, it lost the ability to talk deeply to other mystical traditions, and it lost touch with its own mystical tradition in a profound way. And I think what's happening right now, very broadly, is a recovery of the mystical tradition, the sapiential, meaning having to do with the cultivation of wisdom and transformation, and the sapiential aspects of Christianity that had largely been pushed aside in terms of certain creeds and certain social projects.
So just to repeat back what I heard, you're saying that essentially modernity, or the philosophical modernity, and maybe many other things about modernity, act to kind of maybe blind Christianity to some of its philosophical roots.
Yeah.
And that as it becomes blinded to its philosophical roots, it collapses into a creedal project that loses its orientation towards the cultivation of wisdom.
Yeah.
Say sapiential. And I'm going to try to make the language a little bit more easy for for people. But I think what you mean by sapiential is that it is oriented towards the cultivation specifically of wisdom, not just, like in my conversion to Christianity, I have not actually landed in a place where I have any kind of sense that there is a definitive, logical, rational case for the existence of specifically the Christian God. It's not where my faith arises from, right? If you I was watching Alex O'Connor, Richard Dawkins, and Jordan Peterson, which I largely try to avoid, but I somehow I got plugged into this specific part of the argument. And they're talking about, they're trying to pin him down on the virgin birth, pin Jordan down on the virgin birth. And Jordan just keeps saying he doesn't think it's the right way to ask this question, or it's the wrong question to ask. And I think ultimately that move is not sustainable, right? I think that what Jordan's trying to say is that the frame of science is insufficient in some sense or the frame of just the logical coherence of this specific claim from a scientific perspective is insufficient to understand the power of mythos and religion. And he's worried that every time that you do that, you undercut it. But the problem is that he doesn't actually have an answer to that, right? And in fact, when he finally says something, he says he doesn't know, right? Which you could have just said to me. You can just say that from the beginning. And I think the right move is to say that, in some sense, the Neoplatonic and Christian world gives rise to a specific paradigm for the seeking of truth, an epistemology, or a set of epistemologies that we've come to call science, right? And it's maybe a lot more complicated than we like it to be, but it has given us tremendous power. And whether it's, whether we call it scientific materialism or physicalism, I think at this stage, with what we currently can know about science, my sense is that the right way to try to think scientifically is that the only response to the claim of the virgin birth or the resurrection is we don't know. It's actually not something that we can apply science to. But when we adopt the priors that we generally use across asking scientific questions, we would have to presume that the answer would be no. I think that's the epistemologically fair stance.
Yeah. I'm waiting because I don't want to cut you off.
But I think that where I move to is recognition that scientific paradigm is more limited than we've wanted to believe. And that in that limitation, we can avoid that limitation by trying to explain things away scientifically. Or we can accept a curiosity and an openness to, we don't actually know. We don't actually know, but if we adopt this ontological schema that allows that to be, it also does certain things for us. In fact, perhaps opening the capacity for science itself to operate. And what I place my faith in, is, I've really loved talking to Jordan Hall about pistis, the idea that pistis is not dogmatic belief in proposition without evidence. No. Pistis is actually a skill that arises through embodiment, right?
It's a virtue.
It's a virtue. Yeah.
Yeah, a virtue. It's one of the theological virtues.
Yeah. He said that to me, that faith is embodied. And it really, really hit for me. And I thought about the faith that I have that allows me to do a jump that I could die doing, right? That I have this faith in my body. And I thought about the fact that I could never scientifically claim to know with certainty that my wife won't cheat on me. Right? So if I adopt a stance of radical suspicion, right? That's scientifically justifiable. Right. In fact, that's maybe the way that you're supposed to look at science, right? There's a really terrible way to look at a romantic relationship. treating my relationship with my wife as a scientific experiment is actually a bad model in a lot of ways. Treating it with faith is a good model. And in some sense, what I've found is that adopting faith as central and moving towards a faith in this particular story has afforded me a potential for self-transformation that's been incredibly powerful. And so I think that what I've been trying to articulate and push for is that sense of like, hey, let's respect the epistemology and also recognize that it doesn't give us everything that we need. And there's this other aspect that we have to address. And I don't know that they have to perfectly align. It's sort of like maybe we're at like, general relativity and quantum. It's like they both work in their domains, but we don't have a general unified theory.
That was a lot. There's a lot in there I'd like to reply to. First of all, I'd like to start with the framing. What I did in the course on the cognitive science of religion, and I started the course and I said, I'm not going to give you a definition of or even a description of religion because I can't do that. And I invoke Wittgenstein. The picture there. We have a picture that holds us in its grip, and that picture was given to us in the European Enlightenment, the picture of modernity, and that picture is largely one of a gridlock formed by a bunch of deep dichotomies that are dictatorial for us, that we're not allowed to question, and they frame everything. And these dichotomies are the fact-value dichotomy. There's the world of fact, the world of value. Is ought. You can't go from an is to an ought, David Hume. Analytic, synthetic, Kant. There's things that we know conceptually and things we have to know experimentally.
Yep. You explain the analytic synthetic thing from Kant. I feel like that might be less familiar. It's less familiar to me.
So analytic truths are truths that are true in virtue of their meaning, according to Kant. So in order to determine their truth, you only have to do conceptual analysis. You just have to break the concept apart. You have to analyze it out, and you will get the truth in that. That's where the idea of analytical philosophy comes from. Synthetic truths are truths that are determined by experience, by learning, observing, etc. So
rationalism versus imperialism. Or empiricism, sorry.
Yeah, some parts of rationalism, yes, but it's what Kant is doing with rationalism and empiricism. I would agree with that. He's basically saying that those were what the two sides are talking about, and then he picks that up, and he understands reason as what you can do purely analytically, and then experience is required for synthetic truths, and so he attacks a lot of what he saw as previous metaphysics because he thinks they were confusing synthetic and analytic. And that's part of the critique of pure reason. Right. And I don't want to get too much more technical than that, but what happened is that's kind of the keystone dichotomy. Let me be very clear here. Distinction is something we do pragmatically, right? And we making distinctions. I'm not here to challenge that. A dichotomy is when you take a distinction to have ontological consequences. So you're talking about actually not a division in how we might be talking about it or thinking about it, but a division in reality in a fundamental way. So it involves a kind of dualism, a dividing up of reality in a deep way. And so, for example, when people invoke the fact-value distinction, they're actually invoking a dichotomy. There's the world of fact and the world of value, and and they're completely separate from each other, and you can't get to one from the other, and so forth. So there's fact value, is ought, analytic, synthetic, theory, data, and religion versus science models. And so what I do is I basically take those all apart and show how analytic philosophy and a careful history have destroyed all these dichotomies and just rendered them non-tenable. It doesn't mean we can't pragmatically make use of distinctions in speech, but it's drawing deep philosophical conclusions about how we are to behave, how we are to understand ourselves in reality. That whole project is collapsed. The model of truth, internal coherence and propositional correspondence, that has collapsed. So what I did is I just sort of, like very Wittgensteinian, almost like deconstructionist. I sort of take that whole framework and you deconstruct it. And then what I did was I asked them, now, once you are able to take those lenses off, let's turn back to the phenomenology of our experience, of our connectedness, of religio, and see how it might strike you to start talking about it and using the word sacred and how that emerges for you. That's how we did the course.
Mhm. So you're, in the way that you have described in this conversation, the advent of the sacred,
Yes.
it shifted what I hear when you talk about the sacred, right? Like I've been, so I had a Facebook memory served to me the other day. It was 6 years ago. So 2018. In 2018, I said that I think that I might become religious, but not spiritual,
The opposite of the demographic trend. Very good.
right?
Yeah.
Because I'm a contrarian. But I had been convinced by listening to Jordan Peterson about the utility of the narrative aspect and the symbolic aspect of religion and of the moral and characterological wisdom tradition aspects of these things. And I could see around me, you've talked a lot about the dangers of autodidacticism, right? And what I saw a lot in the community that I grew up around people who'd done a lot of psychedelics is that they had profound spiritual experiences that they had no real wisdom container to guide them through.
Exactly.
And it ended up being a real source of bullshit, right? And I would say that I think in many ways you can see similar things in like charismatic Christianity, which happens in a lot of ways kind of around the same time, or at least it reemerges in a similar context and actually overlaps a lot with the counterculture. So, okay, I'm getting a little stretched out of my point here, but so I wanted to recover the bones of my father. I wanted to understand the role of Christianity and these traditions, and I wanted to be able to do that. And I could imagine myself at that stage, say, going to church, but I couldn't imagine myself making any commitment to the idea that there was anything outside of the natural, right? Like, you use the term non-reductive physicalist, and I think at that time I was maybe a reductive physicalist, and I was very leery of spirituality. You and I had a conversation about this, where I was like, "Why do you use this word? This word is
Yeah, I remember.
is a bad word, right? This word is the word of people who do bad things." And so I wrote a little response 6 years later and said, "Well, I guess I've become spiritual and religious." And so it's happened in my life, right? I've had this advent of the sacred. It's been a really important part of healing myself and the core relationships around me. And then I've seen, folks like Jordan Hall, folks like, there seems to be people who are very surprising to becoming Christians, right?
Yeah, I just talked to Phil Goff recently,
Yeah.
who just became a Christian as well. Yeah.
And so I see that advent of the sacred, let's say. But I saw it more as like it's like an emerging wave. And I'm not exactly sure what it means, was where my perspective on it. I really am not sure what my own conversion means in a lot of ways. And then as you spoke about it, I had the sense that what you're pointing to is a kind of conceptual frame where this new advent of the sacred is in many ways as major a project or a thing to understand as the meaning crisis was. You're seeing a dramatic change.
Yeah, but what I want to say is I think it's both of those, where we'll use the tired metaphor. One is the bottom up aspect and the other is the top down aspect.
Mm.
I think what happened to my students in that course and what they told me is as you take apart the Enlightenment framework, the mind of modernity, the mindset of modernity, what you get is you get fresh eyes and you get something like anthropological recovery, like what Tolkien talked about, and people start to see. And then what happens is that they're not seeing back into something that was just a vacuum or a blank slate. They're seeing into things that were already seething, often somewhat incoherent, but we're driving them in powerful ways. This is what they're telling me. And so the two are coming together. See, for example, people are there's a incoherent dissatisfaction with the flat ontology that we're being given our worldview. And then you have brilliant books like The Blind Spot by Frank Gleiser and my friend Evan Thompson, right around that. But see, and then Greg Enriquez and I, we've been doing work and saying, well, look, once you take apart your commitment to all those dichotomies, we have some flexibility, right? So we don't think of our ontology as just what is derivable from our natural sciences. We think of it also as what must be presupposed by our natural sciences. And we are not concerned with just propositional contradiction. We want to avoid performative contradiction, right? And of course, the argument that I've been making and that Evan's been making is the view, the worldview from which people are doing science is not the same as the worldview that they're speaking on behalf of science, right? And that's the blind spot. And I won't recapitulate those arguments; they're extant. But the point is, when you open up, when you have this extended notion of what consistent with the natural sciences mean, you then get a world view, what we call extended naturalism. And if you put that in with some of the great work done by Eric Hole and others about causal emergence, right, you get very strong forms of something that looks like, remarkably like, and I've been arguing this as well, like the Neoplatonic worldview. And then what starts to happen is some of the deeper dichotomies. And David Bentley Hart, I've got his book. I haven't read it, but I've read some reviews of it. So I know I'm not speaking out of turn here. He's talking about the natural and the supernatural. And he says, well, if you mean by the supernatural what modernity meant by the supernatural, I don't believe in that. That's kind of absurd. But he said, if you go, he's a Neoplatonist, but if you see it like this, and he's making the Neoplatonic gesture, that extended naturalism, he goes, well, then, and see that's what I'm talking about. And that means a fundamentally different understanding of what we used to call. So our old thesis was the sacred is the supernatural in that old sense of the supernatural. It's very otherworldly. It is somehow static, perfect, complete. And what's coming to the fore is something more like what you have in, I think, the ancient Neoplatonic views. No, what's sacred is sacred is this, right? This vibrancy, right? The emanation and emergence, the flow up and down, the inexhaustible intelligibility. That's the most important defining feature of the one, the thing that's most sacred within, right? And because that is what actually orients people. That's what actually transforms people. That's what actually gives people a sense of being in touch with the really real. And I think that we're orienting towards those, what Schellenberg, the Canadian atheist philosopher, calls the triple T. But those three transcendents, what's most real, what's most orienting, and what's most transformative. And it's precisely that, because it's an inexhaustible flow of intelligibility, insight-provoking, inspirational, actually innovative in reality, right? And so what's happening is simultaneously the possibility of a new way of conceiving of the sacred that is also, right, addressing people's need that they want to be connected to something like that, but they don't appreciate or value the modernist understanding of the sacred as the perfect otherworldly supernatural. But see, so they have this, they religio is not optional, right? And so they are looking for that. But the standard model of the sacred doesn't work for them. But there's a conceptual revolution happening. And so the two are finding each other. That's at least my proposal. That's what I see happening.
Yeah. So I really want to dig into that. Give me 1 second, okay?
Sure.
So it's funny. I go back and listen to some of our conversations, and I'll be like, man, there was so much to unpack in 5 minutes. I got to go back and do that again, or go back through it. And that one right there. So at the upper frame, I think what I heard you say is that the sacred, in some sense, is perceived, or it's paradigmatized in a particular way in relationship to the rise of modernism, let's say, in philosophy. And by modernism, we're referring to the period post-Descartes, right? Or, just prior to Descartes, and then kind of synthesized in him. and that this idea of the sacred became increasingly untenable.
Mm-hmm.
Downstream of that, part of the downstream of that is the meaning crisis,
Mm-hmm.
which is reaching ahead. But as it's reaching ahead, science itself is now recapitulating a capacity to understand the sacred, or both science and philosophy, that offers us in some sense, a return to actually an older way, the Neoplatonic way is what you're proposing, of a conceptualizing the sacred, which is in many ways quite different from the modernist conception of the sacred. Like my wife is sort of, she would just self-describe as an atheist, and my oldest daughter both self-describe as an atheist. And as they're questioning me about this emerging Christianity within me, I keep saying, like, if you think God is a sky daddy, then no, I don't believe in that.
Yeah.
Right. I do not believe that there's a being with a white beard and a robe with people and harps sitting in the sky somewhere, or some sky realm, smiting people with a button on a computer that says smite. Like that's not that conception doesn't hold any water for me. But this flat ontology that you mentioned doesn't seem to hold water anymore either.
Yes, that's right.
And that for years I've been talking about this stuff, and I don't have I didn't take any philosophy courses beyond, one or two at university. And so when we use these words, sometimes I'm like, I think I know what we're talking about, but it's always useful to ground it again and continually, in some ways, continually come back to what exactly do we mean when we invoke ontology or epistemology. So science, in some sense, offers us a model of reality, right? It's a tool-like way of finding out certain types of facts about reality. Ontology is a kind of, would be a lower order or higher order, I can never keep those straight, set of claims about reality that are, it's a set of claims about what is true at the most fundamental level.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the right way to describe it? So then epistemology is the theory by which we justify how we claim things are true.
Yeah. And what we got with Descartes was an inversion. So I'm not quite sure it's as if we're not returning. It's not nostalgia. Recovery might be okay. Let me try and explain what I mean. So in the ancient world, you have, obviously, Plato was concerned with knowledge tremendously, but, ontology, it takes priority over epistemology. Ontology, there are questions about ontology, of course, but the idea that you have to do ontology before you can really get your epistemology going, that's pretty much accepted. Descartes inverts that completely, where you have to throw out all of your ontology and start your epistemology from absolute scratch and work your way out. And we've been trying to do that, and it's turned out that project doesn't work either. So, yeah, go ahead.
Is that sort of, I mean, I'm about halfway through the blind spot, but that sounds like essentially what they're arguing is that we're not able to do that backwards in some sense.
Well, I would argue, and this goes back through my supervisor to his supervisor, Chisholm and others.
Yeah.
But the idea that you actually are always doing the two in parallel, and they're feeding into each other. So let's take it in science. You can't use science to establish that reality is intelligible, or that reality has causation, or that reality has predictable patterns that all will carry forward, right? Or that it's measurable, or that mathematics is the appropriate way to measure it and to try and run inference. Like, you can't do science to do any of those things.
Yeah.
Right? Because science presupposes that they are the case. And then, so then you get into weird. Now, what we tried to do is what we have to do is we have to get the ultimate epistemology from absolute scratch that will then justify all the presuppositions we're using in science. And we tried to do that. It was called the Foundationalist Project. And the overwhelming consensus is that project is completely collapsed and completely bankrupt. We can't do that. It doesn't work.
Can you explain why? Like, why is the foundationalist? What is the consensus view on why it doesn't work?
Well, the consensus view on why it doesn't work is you can't, especially if you're stuck within all of those dichotomies. If you hold on to the dichotomies and you hold on the idea that I'm going to get some truth that is something that is completely self-evident, right? You face this really weird problem. How could it be self-evident or self-justifying? And so you try things. You try like, oh, well, I can't doubt it. Then you have this really terrific problem. Well, is your doubt an indication that it's certain or just that you're stupid? Right? Right? I mean, that's a real problem, right? And okay, well, it's not that. Okay, well, no, what it is it's somehow it's self-evident. But when you try and make that work, it just turns into a logical tautology, and you can't derive anything from it, right? And so there isn't, right? And then eventually you get Einstein and Gödel. You get Gödel saying, look, you can't get any formal system that is complete and consistent. That's actually logically impossible. And then Einstein saying, you can't actually get a view from nowhere. That's actually physically impossible. That makes no sense, right? Because there is no absolute space and time, right? The same event can be happening at different times. That's at the core of relativity, right? And so once you get to that, you get to the realization, oh, that won't work. What philosophers then tried was they said, okay, then it's going to be coherence. I get the coherence in my propositions. Gödel is still looming over there for that proposal. But what you have is you got a pretty positivistic philosopher of science saying, but wait, for any finite set of data, the number of logically coherent systems I can generate for it is infinite, literally infinite. So the chances of you and I having the same coherence is infinitely small. And that's not, you see, and one of the properties of reality and knowledge is it's supposed to be shareable. So that doesn't work. Correspondence. Oh, well, somehow my mind I get the thing that really corresponds to the world. Where are you such that you can see that what's in your mind corresponds to the world? I've got to be out here looking at my mind and looking at the world and saying, hey, those are the same. That's not a place you can go to or stand on, right? You're pretending. It's bullshit, really. You're pretending something that isn't possible. And notice also something else. How do I know this? Do I know that directly or do I know it by representation? If I know it by representation, I get an infinite regress. So it actually presupposes the contact with reality it denies. It presupposes something other than subjectivity and objectivity, which it denies. It's a big performative contradiction. Sorry, that's a long argument. I tried to do it very rapidly.
No, it's great.
Just falls apart.
Yeah. So we can't bootstrap epistemology without an ontology.
And you can't do an ontology without also your ontology. This is really important. Your ontology has to be one that makes a proper place for your knowing. One of the problems, and this is where Evan's work and the blind spot, my work converge, is we had an ontology that was saying ridiculous things like, I know that the bottom level is the only level that's real. It's like, you are not at the bottom level, right? That level of knowing and using assertions, right? Like that has to be real for you to draw these conclusions, yet it's not fitting in. So the place from which you're doing your scientific pronouncements is not the place you're pointing to with your scientific pronouncements. It's a performative contradiction.
Yeah. That's been, I think, at the heart of a lot of what I saw Jonathan Pageau arguing, when I first encountered his work. And it's interesting because I told you about the little Facebook post about spiritual, not religious. So a friend of mine, responded and said, I can't believe an intelligent person like you is falling down this religion trap. And, I was like, I don't really even want to have this discussion in this way, but he responds again and he says something about how when we experience God, we think we're experiencing God. It's a part of the psyche, right? And that we misattribute it to God, and that misattribution is dangerous. And so I've had an experience of feeling like Christ was present for me and with me. And I recognize that within a scientific frame, it is absolutely just as plausible, or even maybe more plausible, that that's an intrapsychic phenomenon. And I've made that argument many, many times. But I don't actually see that it's necessary, right? Like it's not a necessary conclusion. It's not definitive that it has to be an intrapsychic thing. And certain things actually make more sense when we treat it as possible that it's not intrapsychic.
I would push harder back on that than you did. You're
Yeah.
kind to your friend. I would say, oh, so you're saying, you have an interest psychic thing, which is something like your metacognitive awareness of your own mind, and yet you're drawing from that metacognitive awareness a conclusion about the nature of reality.
Mhm.
How do you know that's not a misattribution from that intrapsychic state to reality? Oh, you don't. You just privilege one over the other without any independent argument.
Mhm.
Right.
So then the argument is it's dangerous to do that misattribution. But my experience is that my life has become far more wholesome when I make the opposite claim.
And there's a deeper performative contradiction. So people, for example, your friend is saying something that he thinks is scientific, which
Mhm.
is, people only do this if they're given into, intuitive thought. But if people are analytic and reflective, then they're not religious. That's just not empirically true. If you
Yeah.
go out and do the research, that is not the case. And this is research done by atheists, by the way. In
Mhm.
fact, you get weird anomalies, like analytic thought is predictive of religiosity in the United Kingdom.
Mhm.
Like what's going on there, right? Is the United Kingdom the holdover, or it somehow avoided the Enlightenment? That's a hard argument to make, since it was a part of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is people make pronouncements as if they think there's science behind it. But if you actually go in and this is what I did in the course.
Yeah.
Go in and do the science. Go in and do the science. Actually do it. And I'm not a Christian apologist. That's not what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I understand that. So I wanted to finish this point that he made and then reflect on it, because it's exactly what you're saying there. Because then the next step of the argument is, well, we know the neurobiology of how these psychedelic experiences happen. So therefore, they're not real, or they don't represent a real connection to the divine, which is sort of like, to me, that'd be like, I can look at the sound waves hitting your ear and show that mechanically the reason that you hear something is because of a mechanical thing happening in you. Therefore, it's not me talking to you.
I've made that argument. I can tell you reliably the sort of the neural states that are, well, actually, we'll come back to that claim is exactly also very problematic. But let's say that's the case, that it's not going to give you what you want, because presumably there are reliable neurological states that correlate with the use of math and the scientific instruments that scientists are using. Because if they're not reliably correlated, well, guess what? They can't do science. So they're reliably correlated, which means they are not real, because I can say, well, I can predict that this is the neurological state, and therefore the measurements and the math are also not pointing us to anything real. It's a bad argument. It's a very, very bad argument, because what it does is it always privileges, right, one set of things over the other without giving any argument for the privileging.
Yeah, and that's precisely what I'm pointing to, and this is the argument that they make. That what you're saying is, I guess they call it smallism, right? It's like, okay,
Yes.
right? You have, we can reduce theoretically my experience of having, of loving my wife, my experience of enjoying food, my experience of having this experience with Christ. You can reduce it to some set of, well, you can't actually reduce it. That's the lie. But the claim is that you can reduce it to a set of neurological correlates in the brain, that those are real, right?
They're real.
Below those is physics that is real.
Yeah, and again, you could do that with the practice of science, and you could reduce it to neurological events, and that would mean that those practices and everything going on in them is not real. It's misattribution. It's a self-destructive position. It can't hold water. It can't give a proper ontological place to science as a real entity generating real knowledge. This is an old Neoplatonic argument. It's a very old argument. It doesn't mean it's not a good argument.
Yeah. So a flat ontology when you say a flat ontology, this is what I think you're referring to, is this idea that all that there is on some level is the smallest set of things, and that everything above them is just epiphenomenal.
Ned Block made the famous argument. He says, as soon as you accept the reductive strategy, you are compelled to claim that only the very, very, very bottomest level is real. And then how could you possibly, by the way, know that it is the very bottomest level?
Funny is that now that at the bottomest level that we think we can get to, we've gotten stuck, and they're at string theory, and it's basically just theology with math.
Well, it's collapsed too. I mean, string theory is collapsed, but the deeper problem there is, like, when you get down to the very bottom level, like, you're into things that look remarkably like Platonism. You get probability distributions and purely formal entities that don't have any specific spatio-temporal location. And it's like, what was it you didn't like about Neoplatonism again? Can you tell me, please? Because, like, you're talking the same way. You didn't like that it went all the way up and got to these abstract, like, formal entities that exist outside of time and space. But you're okay when you go all the way down, and you, like, what's the difference? That's another argument I make. Those two arguments are exactly symmetrical, and all the reasons you have for rejecting reducing up transfer to reducing down.
Mm.
Here's the key problem, Rafe. It's based on this idea, which I think is right, that intelligibility tracks realness, that there's a non-logical identity between what intelligibility, the property of reality that makes it explainable, understandable, and realness. The stick is more real than the shadow because we can use the stick to explain the shadow, but not the shadow to explain the stick, etc. Realness is a comparative like that. It's a comparative about, right, the directionality of intelligibility. That's right. And then what happened was an equating of intelligibility with generalizability. That to be intelligible is to be generalizable. So the most general is the most intelligible, and therefore the most real. And that's what drives the reduction engine, that you go down, right, to that which generalizes over the most. It's therefore the most intelligible, therefore it's the most real. The problem is not with the equation of intelligibility with realness, it's of equating intelligibility with generalizability. See, intelligibility is about relevance realization, and relevance realization is a point of processing between generalizability and particularization. You need, right, because you always, if you can, I won't repeat the formal argument. I've got a paper out right now on why you can't naturalize relevance realization with computation. But the point is, right, if you go down to pure generalization, you lose all discrimination, and then you lose variation, which means you actually lose information, literally.
Sure.
Literally information.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about this. So the shadow and the stick, right?
Yeah.
The stick explains the shadow, right? Well, we could say, I think maybe the same move is that the brain explains the mind, right?
Really? What's doing that explanation?
Okay. And this is the point Ian McGilchrist makes at the beginning of that. But that's the move that we're making, right? And then that's where we end up with, well, I know the neurobiology of your psychedelic experience, so therefore it's not actually real in an ontological sense.
Notice you got to play a shuffle game, though, because what you have to say is, I know the neurobiology, because the neurobiology is close enough to the cognition that I can actually generate an explanation. But what I have to do strictly is say, but the neurobiology isn't real. I have to go all the way down to the probability collapse. And from there, I have to generate an explanation of your cognition. And good luck with that, because you won't be able to do it.
Yes. Also, we don't even know the neurobiology most of the time.
No, we don't. And the idea, by the way, of sort of straight one-to-one mappings between cognitive states and neurobiological states is collapsing, largely because of the work of Michael Anderson and others. I could go on and on about this, and I
Okay,
have gone on.
so this is I want to dig in on this. I feel like we're playing at a very high abstract level, and I want to be the embodiment guy who can bring it down a little bit. But so if I just to repeat what you said and put it right, like if I want to explain why you behave differently from me, right? And I think the explanatory power always goes down, right? Like, well, we're like, you and I are individuals. So at that level, there's a lot of explanatory power. There's a lot of information. But if we treat each other as human males, then all of a sudden the information available is vastly decreased, right? And now there's 4 billion of us. And then if we go down to the level of like, we're mammals, and then we could go down to the level of we are built off of DNA replicators. Then we can go down to the level of like we're carbon and nitrogen and oxygen, et cetera, right? And we can go to the level of atoms. By the time we get to the atoms that make us up, like we're so far removed from explaining anything to do with like why
and you have this additional problem. You have this additional problem, which is as you go down, the entities become more and more identical, and it gets harder and harder to explain difference.
Yeah.
So, for example, you are not just your bottom-up physiology, you are also your history.
Yep.
And your history is a particular causal pathway that cannot be captured by nomological generalizations. This is why we can't reduce history to science.
Can you be the nomological?
Nomological means law-like. Like, so E equals MC squared. That's a nomological claim. It's supposed to happen like law-like across. So it's not affected by where you are in space and time, right? It's completely general in that way. That's why we think it is powerful. So, but I can't use that to explain why Napoleon lost at Waterloo.
Yeah. I mean, Napoleon's loss at Waterloo in some sense presupposes gravity.
It does. It presupposes gravity, but it also presupposes a particular chain of causal events that is not necessitated by any of those laws, because those laws are multiply realizable in an infinitely large number of possible chains of events.
Yeah, I mean, the presupposition of gravity is necessary, but totally
insufficient,
like, banal, right? It's insufficient, right? It doesn't. It's like, yeah, okay. I mean.
So, and notice, and we keep wanting to do this, but notice that we're being unscientific. We keep saying, look, but I'm going to give you the view that includes it all, which means a view from nowhere, because I'm somehow outside of it, right? And it's going to be the view from nowhere is the description of everything, everywhere, all at once, at all levels. But that kind of formal description is logically impossible.
Okay.
And there is no all at once everywhere. That's physically impossible. You're like, it's based on a picture that isn't actually legitimated by science.
And interestingly, that originates in theology.
Exactly. This is the point that Evan and his co-authors made, that we're pretending that we're somehow God, the standard theistic God, an epistemic mind that's somehow omniscient and omnipresent and everywhere and nowhere. And sorry, I find that just such a problematic thing to state just as a statement. And of course, the classic reason why we don't invoke that entity scientifically is because we reject that, right, within the scientific framework. But the point that they're making is, but we're smuggling it in. We're saying that a being can take that place and be that kind of being. And it's like, then why are you denying God? Well, because there's no blah, 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 blah. That means you've got a huge performative contradiction in your worldview. Yes.
So I want to make...
But this is the crack, Rafe. This is the crack. This opens things up. And now reality shines in a different way for you.
Yes. Yeah, it does. And for some reason, what keeps ringing for me at this stage of the conversation, I'm not exactly sure how to make the logical connection to it. But I was listening to a conversation that you and I had a couple of years ago about, I think, transfer of training. And maybe it was a different conversation that you had with somebody else, but you were talking about ethics, presupposing that ontology actually presupposes ethics. And somehow I ended up in this conversation with you, which I don't know exactly how that happened, but I was like, I brought up the idea that an autopoietic thing has to have motivation.
Yes.
At the most basic level, there's desire.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to get into this because I think that it brings us back to the body. And that's ultimately where I think that's where this advent of the sacred has to take us for it to succeed. And that's ultimately where modernity and postmodernity fail, is that they end up with the body as epiphenomenal. And therefore, in some sense, what really.
But there's a performative contradiction in there, right?
Okay.
Because it's the thing within Descartes, the mentally accessible math is what's most real. But then you get the reductionism that says, yeah, but it's your brain and your body and your neurons, which are physiological entity. And what you're doing is those two are pulling against each other. You get the hyper privileging of the mind on one hand, and then you get the privileging of the body on the other. So you're always using one to ignore the other in this model, and that's very problematic. I would say.
Yeah, I'm trying to capture something because, in all of these conversations, when I watch you and everybody, that I say this every time. It's like, where is the voice of the body in this? That somehow,
Let me give you a place then.
yeah,
I think the body autopoiesis, right, is the grounding. I won't repeat all these arguments. Is the grounding of relevance realization. If you have relevance realization, you realize that you can't maintain the fact value distinction.
Mhm.
There are no facts that are accessible to you that you haven't already deemed relevant for consideration.
Mhm.
Relevance is simultaneously a description and a prescription of what you should pay attention to. It falls below the fact value. Look, here's the problem with the fact value distinction. People think they can have a single sentence corresponding to some single state of affairs in the world. That's what a fact is. Neither one of those exist. Single sentences, right? They bear all kinds of relations of relevance. Well, the cat is on the mat. Well, is a cat a mammal? Right? How is that cat relevant to you? Do you mean the pet over there? Do you mean the tiger? That's different things. They mean different things, right? And so you have this network on the mat. What are you pointing? Like when you're pointing, what are you doing? You're trying to make something salient. This is Quine's problem. What am I pointing to? Am I pointing to the cat's head? Am I pointing to the cat? Am I pointing to the left side of the room? Oh, it depends. It depends on what's relevant. And what am I pointing? Well, I'm pointing to the causal. What cause? You know what causes are at work? The entire history of the universe, right? It's a causal tapestry. You're doing causal relevance. You're always this is inescapable. You can't step out of this. You can't singly point from a single sentence to a single state of affair. There are no facts like this. This is Putnam's argument. You're always what is most relevant, what is most causally relevant, and how do they relevantly fit together? And how are they relevant to whatever problem, even if it's just a problem of making a good claim that I'm undertaking? Relevance is it's lower than the fact value distinction. They are siblings from its common ancestry. And that's because you're embodied.
Yes.
And
Oh.
they see, but see, that's it. You said desire. See, desire is a thick term. I would argue thick terms have both a descriptive and a prescriptive element to it, like rational or wise. Desire does too, because ceteris paribus, desire is a reason for doing something.
Mhm.
And at some level, we have to bottom out and we say, I don't have to justify that. And it doesn't mean it's a foundational, because you can always call it into question. But we say, no, that's just what I want to do. Right.
Mhm.
But that desire, your point is, it's not mere preference. If it is an expression of need, it is a reflection of the fact that you are an autopoetic thing. You are constantly making yourself, you're caring for yourself. So you have to care about this and not that, this and not that, this and not that, moment by moment. Desire and relevance realization are inherently, intrinsically bound up together.
Yeah.
And that's because you're embodied.
So
I don't know. I can't make any sense of disembodied minds. It doesn't make any sense to me. Like literally, it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know what they mean by that. I don't know why I don't, for example, I don't know where a disembodied mind is, because if it doesn't have a body, I don't know how it has a place. But secondly, I don't know why it desires this or that, or how it pays attention to this rather than that. It makes no sense to me.
So, okay.
There are no disembodied minds looking at value neutral facts. That doesn't exist.
So we've talked about the idea of collective intelligences that exist at above the level of a individual body, right?
Yeah, published papers on that.
An entide.
Yeah.
An entide behaves intelligently. It behaves as if it has desire. It is not united in. Is it united in a body?
That's a really tricky question, because, I mean, this is part of Eric Hol's work. You get into important questions about, so when you have intrinsic information, that's information that also has a causal power to it. It's not just correlational.
Mhm.
And so let's say I have one end of a cell and another. Signal needs to get sent, right, from one end to the other. But that's not just signal, it's also causal. Does that make sense? Right? But think of just of communication theory. Well, I don't want to just send one. Like, I need redundancy. And see, and redundancy, by the way, doesn't exist at the level of the smallest. The redundancy is a higher order thing, right? And also, I don't want just redundancy. I also want what's called synergism. I want some of these signals to actually complement each other and correct for each other. So you have this complex, right, network of things going on.
I'm aware that we're running low on time, and there's much more that I wanted to get into with you, but this is there's so much to unpack in this particular thing of really, like, how did we get trapped in the flat ontology? And
read my book.
Yeah. But I'm like, yes. And, obviously, I've had real occasion to have incredible gratitude for how that work has opened me up to experiencing the world fundamentally differently. In some sense, through encountering your work, I have been able to, let's say, escape flatland morally. And that has made me a better husband and father.
And that is one of the most wonderful things I could hear.
My wife and I separated at the beginning of the year, as you know. I don't want to say too much about that because I don't want to overstep what she would be willing to share. But there was a point at which we came back together, and she had seen this profound change in me. And she asked me, like, how the change had happened, right? And in some sense, the change was this change. The change was that I had apprehended her, and I had apprehended our relationship as somehow within this flat ontological system. I had a dream once where I saw myself chopping pieces of meat in a butcher, creating scrap. And when I looked down at the pile of scrap, it was shards of a mirror, and every piece of the mirror was reflecting me.
Oh, wow. What a great dream.
Yeah. This was just a few weeks after the breakup, or even within a week. And so I then saw myself sort of sending out these beams from my head, or not beams, they were rings of light. They were projected out of my head. And then I saw this sort of, it was like a ladder, but of containers. And then there was an image of Beth, and I was trying to stuff her into this container.
Oh, wow. What a powerful dream.
Yeah. And so what I realized was that I was trying to rationalize myself because I was overwhelmed by the reality of what I had, and I needed to be of what I'd experienced through sexual abuse and other things, and I needed to be able to rationalize myself. And then when I encountered this wonderful woman, and she was not perfectly rational, and she was mysterious, and she was always escaping my grasp, there was this part of me that was deeply and profoundly uncomfortable with that. And so there's this instinct within me to sort of like try to box her in because I wanted her to be graspable. And it really feels like there's something like, in the Ian McGilchrist model, I fell in love with my wife through my right brain, and I tried to operate my marriage through my left brain.
Yeah, I'm familiar with this problem.
And so when I encountered Jordan Peterson, he gave me a way of beginning to articulate in a very left brain way values that were actually commensurate with a healthy marriage, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Before that, I was running into love economics and pickup artistry and all these ways of trying to systematize and think about relationship dynamics that are actually ultimately destructive of those very dynamics.
Yeah.
And Peterson gave me this idea of reciprocation there. Like, okay, you can treat your partner as if you were conditioning them like a dog, right? But you should teach them how to condition you too. And you should seek truth together, and you should contend with each other. And that was a good start, but it was not enough. And then I encountered you, and I encountered the idea of agape. And this, like, okay, what if I made an ontological commitment to love as the highest principle? And then when we broke up, I had my conversion moment, and I read Corinthians chapter 13, faith, hope, and love. And I chose to approach my relationship with her from faith, hope, and love. And so there I was with her, and she had seen this change. And I said, this is why I came to this place where I could do that. And it is very much a sense that the tyranny of the propositional is incommensurate with the capacity to love well.
I totally agree. By the way, that it's called a credibility enhancing display, where you underwent something very costly, deep transformation,
Mm-hmm.
and it was predictive of you showing up more lovingly and wisely with your wife.
Mm-hmm.
That's what actually converts people to religions, not arguments.
I'm not interested in trying to argue with people in Christianity.
No, and I know you're not trying to convert Beth.
Yeah.
But the point I made is
Yeah.
that is what actually what the research shows. That's what actually leads people into a religious way of life. So perhaps, and I don't want to take undue credit, but perhaps, Jordan and myself and other people, Jonathan Pajot, and the people you encountered when you were on your journey, were credible in the right way, and that's what actually I think brings about, and for very, very good reason. We have to we didn't quite finish the anti thing, but we are fundamentally dependent on our participation in the collective intelligence of our distributed cognition, in our hive mind, as people like to say, which isn't a good metaphor, by the way. But and that is just fundamentally dependent on trust. The little girl has to trust that the parents see things that she can't see, and have goals for her that she can't properly desire right now. And see, we are capable of being moved not just by desire, but by trust. And trust gives us, we are entrusted with, and we act also out of obligation, right? The child doesn't want to do what daddy's saying, and maybe even doesn't even want to please daddy right now. But the child trusts that daddy or mommy, right, can see things and can correct her in ways she can't do for herself. And she can't be outside to convince herself that that's true, because if she could be outside to convince herself, she wouldn't need to trust in her mom and dad. And so I think it makes very, very good sense that we ultimately, and this brings us back to pistis, we actually rely on, fundamentally, we have to rely on that kind of trust, because it puts us into the machinery by which we can most properly be rational. And I think that's really, really crucial.
Yeah. I had a conversation with Jordan and Paul I think about a week or 2 weeks after Beth and I had separated, which was scheduled before we separated. And that was when he introduced me to that idea of pistis as an embodied skill. And that, that was incredibly powerful for me. At the end of our conversation, he said something that was deeply, deeply meaningful to me. He said, I was asking him, in his evolution of thinking around the crisis of game A.
Yeah.
Like, okay, where are we at now? What is central to solving this? And he said, don't panic and love more deeply. And that became my slogan, basically, for how I was going to respond to Beth. However she responded to me, I was going to do that, and I was going to continue that way.
And you reached out. You reached out to trusted others, and you made good use of dialogical and distributed cognition, which was also a very wise thing to do. You realized that you needed to talk to other people to help you navigate very uncertain waters as virtuously.
Yeah. And that does, in some sense, as you're saying, that the child needs to trust the father, the mother. That is, in some sense, the relationship that I think best aligns us with reality.
I think so too. I mean, truth, trust have a common etymological origin in troth, like in betrothal. It's about connectedness to what is most real. This is why I'm unhappy with the standard meaning in life. If you ask most people, like, well, they have family, they have friends, they have their work, and so on the standard questionnaire, their lives are sort of above average meaningful, but they are beset by all the things we're talking about here. They are beset by all these issues, and this was shown by COVID. Their circle of trust is declining. The meaning that they have in their life is not coordinated with the cultivation of wisdom, the overcoming of self-deceptive, self-destructive. They feel a tsunami of bullshit and burnout. They are starving for fellowship and more flow experiences. They feel radically like unhealthy in their body and in their mind. This is what I mean. This is what we're talking about. And this is what we need to start turning and putting our emphasis on. At least that is what I feel I have to do.
I agree. That's entirely what I believe in. And I'm oriented towards the what comes up for me kind of here as we come to the end of this conversation is a bit, this is not necessarily unique to Christianity, but a big part of what makes me want to sort of ontologically ground in Christianity is the trust that being is good.
Yeah, this came out in the discussion I had with Jonathan and Paul, the ontonormativity, that reality, just as reality, not any aesthetic or moral or even epistemic, just as real, just as being reality is good. We find it as good. And that this is how I interpret one of the important aspects of the Genesis myth. Before there are moral agents, God pronounces reality good. Just when there's light, that's good. That's good.
It is. And I experience it as good when I let myself apprehend the world from the right brain, one might say, or from this part of my mind, this more spiritual part of my mind. And I can't find that in science, right? I can find many things that science enlivens for me and makes me curious about. And I'm not going to run to New Earth creationism and reject all the findings of science. Science is absolutely fascinating to me. I love it. But why do I find it fascinating that, bush dog's closest relative is Maine wolves, right? Like, it's bizarre, right? There's no science, there's no real good science for that, right? I just have an inherent curiosity about being, because being is beautiful, and because I have love, I have desire to know and to be in alignment with being. And when I operate from that place, I watch my relationship with the most important person in my life heal. I watch my children become more confident, more happy, more open, more, and so to go back to the beginning of the conversation, I don't feel the need to sacrifice the epistemology that allows me to say, yeah, I can't make a definitive scientific case that the resurrection or the virgin birth happened. And yet I would rather live my life in alignment with the underlying principle of assumption of the good of being and its fundamental redemptive character that allows me to love my wife like I've never felt love for her since I was 22 years old, and love my children. Why not? Right? Why not live with that?
Well, yeah. First of all, I would say that profound love for ontonormativity is a fundamental presupposition and performative presupposition of science itself.
Yes.
Why the quest? Why the quest to integrate relativity and quantum mechanics? Because we have this sense that reality is one, and it should be one, and it's good that it is one, right? And there's a book by Pass out on this. He's a physicist, called The One, and he's arguing we need to turn back and look at the Platonic world view, because that's probably. But I want to say something else, right? Like Karen Armstrong has a new book out, and it was just given to me as a gift, about the art of scripture. This idea, and this will take us into this would take us into a whole other discussion. I know what Jordan's trying to do, and I understand why you're also rejecting it. But I mean, he's trying to take the Jungian stance. And the problem with the Jungian stance is your friend can come in and say, oh, but it's just an intrapsychic event. And then, right, I get that. I know, I understand the concern. But the ancients and the medievals did not regard the literal level of the text as very important or relevant. And I understand what Jordan's trying to do. He's trying to say, you're confusing truth with relevance. You're trying to pin the relevance of the scripture to the literal truth of these. And that is not what has the healing power, the transformative power. And it's not what puts people in contact with what is deeply real, right? It's you're using a model. You're using the Enlightenment model. Fundamentalisms that's an invention of modernity. There's no fundamentalists before modernity, right? Fundamentalism was an attempt to try and make religion, Christianity in particular, like science as it was understood by the people who had a misunderstanding of what science is. It's a really warped history. I turn it around and say, if I just saw the resurrection of the virgin birth, I don't see why that would do any of the stuff I need a religion to do for me. What would it do for me? I can't explain. That doesn't push me into any one particular religious framework. It doesn't even necessarily push me. I don't. What if it turned out that we couldn't take a videography of these events, right? I can see one thing, but my concern is, suppose we did. Suppose we had some sort of weird time machine. We went back and look, here's the video. Look, he was dead and now he's alive. And we go, we can't explain that. And then that's what we would. That's the only conclusion we can draw from it. Logic. We see you see what I'm saying? Logically, we can't explain that. That's it, right?
Yeah.
So, right.
Sure.
So, I think trying to pin. I worry going the opposite way. I know your concerns, and I've said I've acknowledged them, but I worry about going the other way of the God of the gaps kind of argument, which is, well, it turns out we actually did the science, and this is what Jesus was doing when he was resurrected. And look at what happened. It was quantum collapse from the multiverse and blah, 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 blah. And then what happens? Does God go away when we come up with that really astonishing discovery? I'm not
really trying to argue for the God of the gaps, I don't think.
No, I didn't say you were. I was trying to defend.
Yeah.
I'm trying to balance these sides out.
As I've kind of been navigating this space, talking to Jonathan, reading Jordan, talking to Jordan, talking to you, what's always been really precious to me is the sense of grounding in a real orientation towards truth that I found within science that I didn't experience in the spiritual blah, blah, blah of my hippie upbringing.
And that's the right thing. Look. Here's what I'd say to Dawkins. Hey, look, here's a textbook. Do you think the atom literally looks like that? 2-dimensional circles around a center? Is that literally how it is? Oh, well, so why should I believe in your science? Like, come on. This is Elgin's book. True enough. Even most of science is dependent on what she calls felicitous fictions. things that we put them in because they imaginally orient us so we get access to the truths we need to get access to.
Yeah.
That's how I treat things like the virgin birth and the resurrection. I treat it like the solar system model of the atom.
And that's a very interesting way to treat it, because it doesn't imply that there is an underlying truth. It's just a truth that we can't apprehend fully.
Yeah. And we only look, we can't get, the reason why we keep it in the textbooks is we can't get to those truths until we have to pass through this indispensable stage of taking on the solar system model of the atom and then looking through that. And then eventually we realize that this is mostly false and we abandon it. But we got to the place where we can see things that not only caused us to abandon the solar system model, but got us closer to how the atom actually is. And here's the thing, Larry Lawton, even our best current science is going to go through that process. Even our best theories right now are going to turn out to be imaginal, because they're going to be turned out to be largely false, because that has been the complete history of science up till now. And there is no rational reason to believe that's going to change.
So I think this gets you into potentially heretical territory, but it's quite interesting to me, because what I hear you propose in some sense is that to apprehend God, as a Christian at least, we have to look at the question of God through the resurrection and the virgin birth, and we have to treat them as if they are true, and then approach God in some sense with the recognition that the way in which we perceive them as true will end up being mostly false.
Exactly.
That's a very interesting place to stand. I don't think, yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's what Gregory of Nyssa was talking about. I haven't read.
Yeah, I would. I was exactly the argument I'm going to make. I would say I can cite a lot of people from the Neoplatonic Christian tradition, and also the Vedantic tradition, also the Buddhist tradition, who would agree with what I just said. And also the atheist, Schellenberg, says that's how we should be treating religion imaginally rather than factually.
Yeah, I mean, the Gospels don't agree with each other in lots of places. And no story that's ever been written down in text can be captured in mind. Like, if I read the Gospel and you read the Gospel, we don't read the same story.
Well, that's the same way when you and I enter a room. We don't but notice what we don't get. We don't get two incommensurable things that can't possibly talk to each other. And we don't get two logically identical things, because we're bound into relevance realization.
Yeah. John, I want to keep going. I have to go. There's a conversation that I think this kicks off for me around, I think one of my big concerns is transhumanism and what I call escape eschatology. And it is this move that I think is the kind of modernist, postmodern problem, where you end up with the duality of mind, body, and then this kind of and I was listening to the conversation we had about postmodernism, and I was like, what this conversation needed was a deeper discussion of modernism,
which we just had.
Yeah, and then what I experienced with my wife this year, it has really brought me to this deep sense that, like, the love that men and women have for each other is really foundational to everything that we experience. And we don't know how to talk about it or think about it or do it well anymore. We don't have a good theory of that. And it's so, for me, I was talking to Beth about this, it's so complex because it's so multi-layered, right? Mm-hmm. The assumption of complete egalitarianism doesn't work. We're not the same. But the traditional models of complementarianism seem very shallow to me, or at least as they're currently understood. Yeah. And so I'm struggling, like with that question that you asked me a while ago, of like, what makes a good man specifically, and not just a good person?
Yeah.
And I feel like I've gotten many layers of sophistication deeper on that question, and I'm still working on it. But I think it's so central because, I think about, like, Jordan Hall talking about wholesomeness. It's like, this is really the wholesomeness that I think we're called back to, is people need to fall in love, have children, raise families, raise gardens, build communities. It's like, we can philosophize, we can have practices, we can do all these things, but if those fundamental rhythms of life are something we're divorced from, and they are, right? Like in Korea, I think they're down to like 0.43 children per woman. And it's hard not for me to see that as actually a rejection of that fundamental belief that being is good. And I see that all over the place on what I consider the sort of the left, and maybe it has its own resonance on the right as well, but the kind of extreme wokest left, like there is like in some sense an assumption that the being of human beings at minimum maybe not good. And
I think it's deeper. This is part of what I mean. What's missing from, I think, in addition to the meaning in life construct, we need a meaning in world. Do people think reality is good? Is being
yes,
good? Is reality good? And I think both. I'd push a little harder than you do. I think the both right and left have come to the conclusion that being isn't good, and they have different responses to that. And we could probably make good comparisons between that that have political consequence. I'm not just trying to be
yeah.
wishy-washy, but I'm saying I don't think it's true to accuse just the one side of harboring
I'm
this.
not. Yeah, I've been thinking about beauty because Jordan, for a variety of reasons, but Jordan Hall talks about the primacy of beauty in his model, right? That's the ontological primitive is beauty itself, right? What
Yeah, well,
attracts us into being desire.
he gets that via me from David Schindler, right?
So Schindler. So I've been thinking about that, and I walk around in my very left-wing town, and I see people who are their aesthetics to me seem like they're anti-beauty. And we know that this goes into all the way back to the history of the beginning of modern art, which is in some sense like modern art. The modern art period is a kind of like the beginning of postmodernism in some sense on a cultural level.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And as famous modern art critics said that the purpose of modern art is the death of beauty.
Yes.
And so I see that taken up on the left, and I see people who seem to be making themselves mentally unhealthy, making themselves physically unhealthy, choosing to chop their hair in super strange and unaesthetic ways, choosing to tattoo themselves all over. And it feels like there's actually a sense that beauty itself is bad because it creates hierarchy. And so therefore we sacralize a sort of asceticism of anti-beauty.
Yes.
And so that's one side, but then on the other side you have the most shallow, unwholesome expression of,
Yeah.
right? So you could, I associate the kind of far right online with lots of women who have fake hair and Botox and fake breasts. And the Botox thing I think is particularly powerful because when you get Botox, you actually lose your capacity to feel a little bit.
Yep.
Because feelings are actually embodied states that are associated with microexpressions. And so when you deaden your capacity to express something, you
Totally.
deaden your capacity to feel it. So on one side, we have a side that actually dramatically rejects beauty. But on the other side, you have a side that says, no, we believe in beauty theoretically, and we're going to adopt something that is completely surface layer.
Yes.
And that cannot point us towards the deeper level of beauty, right? The way that I experience my wife at this stage is that her beauty shines forth for me so powerfully, even though she has wrinkles now, right?
Yeah.
Right. Like, and I would not want her to get Botox because I want to see her face, right? The way her face fully expresses. It's not just the skin. It's the human who expresses through the face. And so this anti-beauty and it's manufactured, it's artificial.
Yeah. It's smooth on sense.
Yes, it is. It is precisely that, the aesthetics of the smooth. And there's something in that dichotomy of these two reactions to beauty that to me gets at this point you're making of how both are actually not aligned with the fundamental assumption of the goodness of being. We're not aligned with the goodness of aging for sure.
I think that's right. I think what they both share is I've tried to explain them both as instances of the hermeneutics of suspicion, and which is the radical opposite of the hermeneutics of beauty. So So the reason why you stay at the superficial, right, is you're suspicious of the depths. And this, when the right is at its worst, it becomes this kind of anti-intellectualism and other things like that.
Well,
And then
you can see all the dialogue on the manosphere left about like a woman, like women are only attractive until they're 25, right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
these terrible,
it's horrible. And but also you said, from Duchamp's onward, that we don't care about beauty. We want to kill it, because we want something like the recognition of the artist in art history to be what
yeah,
determines something. I think both of those are because people have become afraid of the depths and the dark in a really profound way. And it's because they have lost the deep trust that they can go into the depths, because reality is trustworthy at its depths. And I think that's part also of what modernity gave to us. It gave us Freud, it gave us Nietzsche, it gave us Marx, it even gave us the aspects of Descartes, right? And the evil genius, right? I was talking about hermeneutics of suspicion there. And so um, for me, the only proper response is the Platonic response, that, like realness, the hermeneutics of suspicion is a comparative. I can only say something's illusory or deceptive by comparing it to something that's non-illusory, non-deceptive. And that's the hermeneutics of beauty, where appearance discloses depth rather than distorting or distracting. And I think part of what I'm now seeing, the meaning crisis, is more about the loss of a trust in the depth of reality, not just that people don't have purpose or in their life and things like that.
it calls me back to that image of myself chopping the pieces of myself off and then trying to
Yeah,
stuff Beth into the box.
yeah, yeah.
And that was very much the sense. Was there was, I wrote something about approaching her as an unfolding mystery,
Yeah.
and that if I could do that, that I could love her well.
I like going
That's
back
the
through Collingwood back to the idea that that's what art used to do for objects that we would otherwise treat in a very superficial fashion. Art would remind us, cause us to remember viscerally, perceptually, the mystery of things. Like, Heidegger talks about Van Gogh and the painting of the shoes, right? And you get this tremendous sense that art makes us pause from the way we flatten and trivialize things and remember their mysterious presence.
Yes, art also is siloed and no longer present in our day to day in many, many ways.
Right. And that's because of the fact value distinction and the is-ought distinction, or
Yep.
dichotomies, I should say.
John, I know we're taking you way past. You told me your stop time. Obviously, we can go for a long time. It's really been incredibly wonderful to just be back in this kind of arena with you. It's
I
wonderful
loved it.
off camera, but I think that for me and where I want to go, it's really valuable to have these with you. And I'd love to get you on again soon and dive deeper into this topic, because it doesn't feel like we came to a full end of this particular conversation. And there's a point that I want to go to around embodiment, ethics, transhumanism that I would really like
Yeah.
to return to soon.
Good. Happy to come back.
I'll
Thank you so much.
I'll get it arranged. But ta-ta for now.
Okay. Bye-bye, my good friend.